Hey there. I am Tamara Rockwood, CEO and co-founder of the still young and up-and-coming Pacific Northwest poetry publishing house, Bainbridge Island Press, along with my husband, Ben Rockwood. We launched this publishing house in December of 2022, and as of today, we have successfully and happily published 9 stunning, gorgeous books already, ranging from individual collections of poetry to international poetry anthologies. We've spent the past 2 years collecting poetry, meeting debut poets and established poets. We've visited book festivals. We've hosted a number of poetry readings. We have put poetry books into hands and poetry into hearts. And now we are launching a podcast. POETICS Podcast by Bainbridge Island Press will be 10 minutes per episode, so it's half a TED Talk. January 1st, we are launching a series of podcasts composed of Wednesday podcast episodes with our own poets, and Saturday episodes will be with surprising guests. But in the meantime, while we get everything very organized, during the next 2 months, Ben and I will be exploring really interesting poetry here and just really enjoying the beauty and scope of poetry and what it is saying, why it is saying it, who is saying it, and is it important? How is it relevant? I am so excited to be here and to launch our debut POETICS podcast. It is a privilege to be here and to discuss poetry with poets and poetry enthusiasts. So for our first episode, today is Saturday, November 2nd, 2024, for posterity. Our first guest is Ben Rockwood, and he's going to be reading a poem by Charles Bukowski titled Balloons. And just for context, for those who are not familiar with Bukowski, if you've ever felt like an outsider, Charles Bukowski is your patron saint. He was born in Germany in 1920. He was raised in Los Angeles. He spent a lot of time in New York, and he discovered wine, as some poets do, and he found his way back to Los Angeles. He wrote hundreds of poems, but he wrote a memoir called Ham on Rye. And he was inspired by going to the library, and he was at first frustrated because he couldn't find anything that he could identify with, which is something that a lot of us experience. There are an infinite number of books that have been written in the world, and how do you find the one that you're like, this is what it feels like in my head. This is how it feels when I think. This is when they're talking about emotion. This is how it feels when I grieve, when I love, when I am astonished, when I hope. And it takes us talking to each other. It takes relationships for someone to say, I found a book, and they give it to you. So he found in the library, through the help of librarians and friends, John Fonte. And he said, this is the way it feels. And he's like, oh, I can write. And so he started writing more. And it became a new voice in poetry. So his breakout novel was Post Office in 1971. He was 50. And after that, it was just a lot of soul searching for himself. And he didn't write academic papers. He didn't write literary poetry. He wrote from his heart, and he wrote what he saw. And so he wrote about the absurdities in the world that were very real to him. So his writing wasn't flowery in language, but the themes were complex and deep with a very profound simplicity. He showed us that poetry does not have to be lofty. It does not have to reference classical figures. It does not have to be confusing. It does not have to be mysterious. It doesn't have to use language that you would never use. He once said, "We are here to laugh at the odds and give our lives so well that death will tremble to take us." And I think that that's what he did. So I hope that you enjoy this reading of Balloons by Ben Rockwood.
Balloons by Charles Bukowski. Today they shot a guy who was selling balloons at the intersection. They parked their cars at the curbing and called him over. He came over. They argued with him about the price of a balloon. They wanted him to come down in price. He said he couldn't. One of them started calling him names. The other took out a gun and shot him in the head twice. He fell right there in the street. They took his balloons and said, "Now we can party." And they drove off. There are also other guys at that intersection. They sell oranges mostly. They left them, and they weren't at the intersection the next day, or the next, or the next. Nobody was. As my first pick of a poem here on the Poetics podcast, I thought I'd find something that really was challenging, challenging the status quo, challenging what most people think poetry is or is about. Charles Bukowski certainly has a different approach than most. On one hand, I enjoy his clarity. There's no attempt to sort of romanticize the language. It's not dense or complicated. It just is. It reads very easily. It reads very simply. It has a very sort of natural rhythm. Particularly if you've ever heard him read, and if you haven't heard him read, I'd recommend that you do. As soon as you've heard his voice, every time you read one of his poems, you'll sort of hear it in his cadence. He has a very unique kind of da-dum 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 sort of cadence in the way that he approaches, the way that he speaks naturally. You hear it in interviews, as also in his poetry. So it's just very natural. It's very much his voice. And he speaks about things that are very raw and unvarnished. This is one that I particularly like just because of the juxtaposition of it, right? I mean, it's a poem called Balloons. If anything, this should be, light and airy, right? It should be shiny and happy, as a balloon is. But no, instead it's about a murder that happens on a street corner in Los Angeles. This is also near and dear to my heart, not only because of that juxtaposition, but also because of the fact that anyone who spent time in Los Angeles, while the balloon salesman is sort of a from a bygone era. I can't recall the last time I ever saw somebody selling balloons at some kind of an event. Orange carts, however, are very prevalent all over Los Angeles, and anybody who spent time there will have seen an orange cart before. And frankly, in a lot of neighborhoods, it's not that unthinkable to think of something like this happening actually to an orange cart. So I think, maybe there never was a balloon salesman, and what he was really trying to do was to suggest, a murder of somebody selling oranges, but instead decided to use a balloon salesman as a way to sort of create more contrast, which it works very effectively. This type of style just is not unique at all for Bukowski. All of his poems are this way. But if you've never read Bukowski, I think this is a good one to sort of knock you into a different way of looking at poetry, and to sort of be prepared for what else you're going to find elsewhere in Bukowski. I wish there were more poets who had this kind of approach, but there really aren't that many. It's very hard to find somebody quite like him. So it's an important voice, and one that is fun to share with friends, particularly to challenge somebody who says, I don't like that poetry stuff. It's all girly, or it's too it's too academic. I can't do that. Let them read a little Bukowski and see if that's how they feel.
That is all for today, poetry friends. If you've enjoyed diving into the world of verse with us, please join us next time. We've got more poets to meet, more poems to explore, and more literary adventures to share. Until then, keep reading, keep writing, and keep poetry close to your heart. Thank you for joining Poetics Podcast, where we bring poetry to life, one verse at a time.